Greetings, Starfighters. Welcome to the next episode of Shameless Cashgrab. And our next movie is 1962's The Bloody Vampire, like I said at the end of the last episode. Based on the plot description on the back of the DVD here, it looks like we're getting an actual vampire movie on this vampire set. Okay, I kid. The other movies, the first two movies had vampires in them too. It was only Atom Age Vampire where the vampire connection was tenuous, to put it kindly. But this one, yeah, I mean, it mentions vampire hunters and vampire castles, so we're definitely getting some vampires in this one.
And now I've watched The Bloody Vampire, so let's just get right into it. And if this seems rushed, it's because it is. Not because I have any particular ill will towards the movie, but because I couldn't find as many images as I wanted to for it, and I don't want to have to cycle through them all like 5 times. So the plot summary, such as it is, comes from IMDb. Count Cagliostro, sadly no Lupin III in sight, whose family has tried for generations to rid the world of vampires, instructs his daughter and her fiancé to protect several valuable documents. Sorry, I had trouble finding a summary for this movie that wasn't either super short, wrong, or in Spanish, and I don't trust Google Translate. But yeah, we have another foreign film. Well, foreign for me anyway. I mean, granted, most of my audience is American, based on the analytics, but I know I have at least one German viewer. The point is, we have a Mexican film this time around, which is a first for this series. We also have a bit of a long one, almost 2 hours. That's longer than average for this set. And yet there are still moments in the film that feel like several frames have been chopped out. Nowhere near as bad as the editing in this set's cut of Atom Age Vampire, but still. As for this film, it opens on an odd combination of nicely done stylistic slow motion involving a quiet horse and carriage, and a really clumsy exposition dump. But it is during this exposition dump we meet the film's heroes, which includes a mad scientist. The mad scientist is named Count Cagliostro, who I mentioned earlier, and he is said to be descended from the town's original inhabitants. We also meet his deformed assistant named Justice. By the way, you did hear me right. The guy who, in the clumsy exposition dump, talked about stealing cadavers for his experiments is on the side of the good guys. He's one of the vampire hunters. Points to you, movie. I would have never thought of that. Of course, I'm reminded of that line in Mass Effect 3 when Joker's talking about Warden Solus, and he goes like, hey, why should the bad guys get a monopoly on mad scientists? Anyway, after all of this, we're introduced to our main vampire, Count Frankenhausen. Yes, really. Frankenhausen. What a name. And of course he's a count because, some cliches transcend national borders. But you can't say the actor doesn't have the classic hypnotic stare that cinema's great vampires like Lugosi, Langella, and Lee had. What he's staring at in this sequence is anybody's guess, because he seems to be hypnotizing someone in a closed box while looking at something way on the opposite end of his lair from said box. Bad framing. So Frankenhausen, God, I can't believe they actually call him that. Anyway, he monologues to a bunch of catatonic women in coffins who don't react to anything. Write your own joke for that one, I'm not going there. We cut back to Cagliostro, and we learn what his goal is and why he has Justice, who is basically his Igor, steal dead bodies for experimentation. I feel the need to remind you that this guy is in fact on the side of the heroes. This is all part of his long-term goal to combat vampirism, which I guess in the rules of this setting is a communicable disease. This is all done in a very, as you know, Bob, sequence. I would have to say that the exposition is probably this movie's biggest weakness. But all this includes talk about a vampire who prefers to attack during full moon nights. I feel like someone might have gotten their wires crossed regarding vampire and werewolf myths. So why does Count Frankenhausen only kill on the full moon? As the movie progresses, the lead vampire sets up his own demise by allowing a potential witness to leave his house untouched. A doctor who is the fiancé of Dr. Cagliostro's daughter, who had come to the manor to see to his, the vampire's, wife. The wife, by 1960 standards anyway, is kind of a badass. Once she wakes up, she doesn't hesitate to threaten her husband with a wooden stake aimed right at his heart. She only doesn't kill him because he's the father of her daughter, and she doesn't want the kid to know that Daddy's a vampire. Keep waiting for that Twilight joke. I said at the end of last season I wasn't going to do that. The doctor's not here for that part, by the way, but that's why I only said potential witness. The movie, during at least the first half, keeps cutting back and forth to Count Cagliostro's lab, and honestly, if it weren't for the other people there, these scenes would feel like a boring CDC lecture. You know, the kind that one should pay attention to, but is delivered so dryly it's hard to stay awake, even though the information being imparted could save your life. That kind of lecture. But after all of this, we get to the spy portion of the film, which takes up a good chunk of the runtime and honestly could have been shorter. This involves Cagliostro's daughter essentially going undercover to prove that Frankenhausen is... Frankenhausen. God, that name. Ugh. It's during all this that we get something I don't think I've ever seen before. This movie's vampires drink coffee. I'm not kidding. The Count even makes a point of telling a dinner guest the trouble he goes to get it imported. The movie never gives a specific year, but if coffee is seen as exotic by even a doctor, the village's remoteness could have more to do with that. But, yeah, coffee-drinking vampires. Do I make a Lorelai Gilmore joke? A Captain Janeway joke? Or a Howard Schultz joke? Before we move on from this section of the film, though, I have to give props to a scene that I certainly hope was intentionally funny, where one of the characters, the young doctor I mentioned earlier, engaged to Count Cagliostro's daughter, tells Justice that he doesn't think that the lead vampire is a vampire, which is immediately followed by a jump cut to said vampire lying in his coffin under a coat of arms with a bat on it. That had to have been on purpose. That was just too perfect. Anyway, not too long after all of this, the shit hits the fan as the lead vampire learns about the spy in his home, and how his family's mortal enemy, the Cagliostros, have been living nearby. Seems like something you should have known a long time ago, but whatever. The tension ramps up. I realize that Count Cagliostro seems to have unceremoniously disappeared from the movie more than a half hour ago. There's some slow motion that sadly feels more like padding than the much better slow motion sequence from the open of the film. There's some bizarre music and sound effect choices in the climax. Not to mention the goofy-looking bat puppet. And Cagliostro's assistant and the vampire's wife are both dead, and possibly the thralls from earlier in the movie too. We never see them out of their coffins, so they might as well have been set dressing. And Cagliostro comes back to the film pretty much just to sequel bait. The end. It turns out that The Bloody Vampire was the first film in a trilogy. Sadly, the other two films do not appear to be included on this set. Oh well, at least it didn't really end with a cliffhanger. I mean, yeah, the vampire got away, but that's to be expected from this kind of movie. Even ones that don't get sequels. Random thoughts I had while watching the movie. One problem I had with The Bloody Vampire early on is that some things just don't come across as clear as they should. Twice in just the first 10 minutes, I had written down some snide comments about the characters commenting on something that wasn't what they said it was, but in a later scene, a close-up would reveal that, in fact, it was exactly what they said. It could be a side effect of the copy on this DVD being a bit grainy, but I don't think so. Plenty of things show up fairly clearly, considering the age and budget of the film. This is the kind of reveal first, justify later storytelling that I got rightly dinged for in a review for my one self-published novel. I'm not linking to that. I wrote it 11 years ago, and I've grown so much as a person since then, I don't even... Moving on. There's a place in this movie called Haunted Hacienda. It's important to the plot. But more than that, it's just fun to say. Haunted Hacienda. Haunted Hacienda. Try it. You'll see I'm right. Final verdict? This movie is a mixed bag. There is a fair amount about it to like, including but not limited to the fact that most of the female characters in the film that aren't already enthralled by the main vampire have more agency than one would expect from a film of this time period. Well, for the first half anyway. This movie mostly passes the sexy lamp test.
In case you didn't know, the sexy lamp test measures how relevant a female character is to the plot of a work. The test was established by writer Kelly Sue DeConnick. The full test is, quote, if you can take out a female character and replace her with a sexy lamp, you're a fucking hack, end quote. The sexy lamp DeConnick refers to is the one from the 1983 movie A Christmas Story. We now return you to your regularly scheduled program.
Though, sadly, despite this, there's still issues where problems could have been avoided, or at least mitigated if characters talked to each other a little more often and openly. On the other hand, nearly every scene with Count Cagliostro is painfully dull, and that makes the already longer than usual for a Mill Creek set movie runtime feel even longer. And then there are the contrivances. Oh, so many contrivances. So much of this film is predicated on people whose families have lived there for generations, somehow not knowing who their neighbors are. If this were taking place in a major metropolitan area, that would be one thing, but this is a village in, I'm guessing, late 18th century Mexico? Maybe Germany, probably Mexico. I mean, both German and Spanish names are used for people and places in this movie, so it's a little hard to tell. Yeah, I'm leaning towards Mexico. That all said, I think this would be a suitable movie for riffing. Not quite bad enough to be so bad it's good, but not unwatchable either. Probably the most MST3K-worthy film to be featured on Shameless Cashgrab since back in Season 1. I also think you could probably get a solid remake out of this too, though obviously the first thing that would need to be cut is the clunky exposition. Up next, 1973's Crypt of the Living Dead. It's not a zombie movie, I checked.